everyone. Today we are starting the respiratory system. So remember, like I said, Health Science 1 and Health Science 2 kind of changed over the summer. And so this year is the first year that we are going to be covering the respiratory and circulatory system as part of Health Science 2, which is why some of this might kind of be a review for you, but that just means that hopefully you have a heads up on what's going on and maybe this content won't be as difficult for you to understand. So in the future, respiratory and circulatory are always going to be a part of Health Science 2 starting now. So what is the respiratory system? The respiratory system is a biological system that allows us to breathe through the process of oxygen and carbon dioxide exchange. So basically, we breathe in oxygen and we let out carbon dioxide. It is formed by a lot of different structures such as the nasal cavities, the mouth, the trachea, the bronchi, and the lung. The first structure we're going to be talking about is the nose. So, of course, you know that your nose is on the front of your face and that's where we breathe air in. And it enters into the respiratory system through two oval openings in the nose called your nostrils. And the nasal cavity is just that space located directly behind your nose. You have a vestibular region and an olfactory region, as well as a respiratory region that make up the nose. The nasal septum is that cartilage piece that divides the nose into right and left sides. And then within your nose, you have three different things called turbinates. Turbinates are scroll-like bones inside the respiratory region of the nose, and they help to increase the surface area of the nasal cavity. So you can look on the image on the screen and see those three different turbinates. You have your inferior nasal turbinate, your middle nasal turbinate, and your superior nasal turbinate. And then lastly, we have our cilia, which are located inside of our nose, and these are known as our nose hairs, and they help to trap and prevent the entry of large dirt particles and bacteria and other types of pathogens. That basically your nose hairs are like a filtration system for the air that you breathe in. Next, we have our sinuses. And our sinuses are located in our skull. They are actual cavities inside the skull. And the ducts connect the sinuses to the nasal cavity. Your sinuses are lined with a mucous membrane, which helps to warm and moisten the air that enters into our system. And it also helps to provide the resonance to the voice. So your sinuses actually play a role in what you sound like, which is why when you have a sinus infection and you have some stuff going on with your sinuses, sometimes the sound of your voice will change. You'll sound really nasally. Maybe you'll lose your voice completely. And that could all be related to the actual sinuses. Your pharynx is something that actually is used for the digestive system and the respiratory system. Your pharynx is also known as your throat. And you actually have three sections of the pharynx. You have a nasopharynx, oropharynx, and laryngopharynx. And those three different sections are just a way to divide up your pharynx. In total, it's only about 5 inches in length. And it's typically a common passage for air and food. So you use your pharynx to breathe in air, and then that air travels down your trachea, whereas you also use your pharynx to swallow food, and that food in the digestive system would then travel down your esophagus. So the pharynx is a common passageway for both systems. And then you have your epiglottis located at the back of your pharynx, and this is the actual flap or lid that helps to close over the opening of the larynx when food is being swallowed. Your epiglottis basically prevents you from swallowing food down the wrong pipe. Your larynx, or also known as the voice box, is a triangular chamber located below your pharynx. Within the larynx are your vocal cords and the glottis. And this is also sometimes referred to as an Adam's apple, which is typically able to be seen more in men. And your larynx helps with the production of sound and the production of your voice. Next, we have our trachea, our bronchi, and our diaphragm. The trachea is what basically helps to filter the air that we breathe and then branches off into the bronchi. So you have your pharynx, which is your throat, which then travels down into the trachea, which is then going to branch off into your lungs or your bronchi and then into your lungs. The trachea is also sometimes referred to as your windpipe. The bronchi are the two air tubes that then branch off from the trachea and help to carry the air into your lungs. And the diaphragm is that muscle that actually sits right below your lungs and contracts and relaxes itself in order to give more space for your lungs to expand or release air, depending on the situation. So your trachea, like I said before, is also known as your windpipe, and it's really the passageway of air from the larynx to the bronchi, and you have one bronchi for each lung. And this is composed of alternating bands of C-shaped rings of hyaline cartilage. And this basically keeps the trachea open for the passageway of air or oxygen into the lungs. And I'll show you an image of the trachea on the next slide. After your trachea, you also have many other structures such as the bronchi, the bronchial tubes, bronchioles, alveoli, lungs, pleura, mediastinum, and diaphragm. Some of these you've heard before and some of them maybe not. The bronchi are at the lower end of the trachea, again, which divides into right and left bronchus, and your bronchial tubes are the subdivide from the bronchi into the lungs. So as the bronchi enters the lungs, they then subdivide off again, kind of like tree branches into the bronchial tubes, and they just continue to carry air into the lungs. And then past your bronchial tubes, you have your bronchioles, which are what also subdivide again into smaller tubes that carry air. Within your lung, they are not hollow. Your lungs are actually a kind of spongy looking material, and at the end of each bronchiole is something called an alveoli, and they kind of look like a sack of grapes at the end of each bronchiole. And inside the alveoli is actually where the exchange of carbon dioxide and oxygen takes place. When people say we exchange carbon dioxide and oxygen in the lungs, technically they are correct, but if you want to be very specific, that exchange actually takes place in the alveoli. The lungs are, of course, the cone-shaped organs that actually fill the two chambers of our thoracic cavity. And fun fact about your lungs you're going to learn on another slide is that your lungs are made of different lobes, and on one lung you have 2 lobes, and on the other lung you have 3 lobes, and there is a reason that they are different. Your pleura is the lining of the thoracic cavity. Your mediastinum is basically that space in between the 2 lungs, where the midline of the thoracic cavity is found. So if I were to have 2 lungs on either side, the space in between the 2 lungs would be the mediastinum. And then your diaphragm, again, is that muscle that separates your thoracic cavity from your abdominal cavity and helps contract and relax to allow for breathing. Here's an image of what all of that kind of looks like together. So your trachea, as you can see, is wrapped with those cartilage bands of hyaline cartilage. On your lower respiratory tract, you can see the trachea all the way down to the diaphragm. You can see where everything breaks off into the different bronchi, into the lungs. The lungs are the main organs of the respiratory system, and inside the lungs is where we take in oxygen and breathe out carbon dioxide, which again takes place in the alveoli. You have 2 lungs, and together they weigh about 2.9 pounds. But one lung actually contains a small cut-out section called a cardiac notch. So as you can see on this image down here, the left lung kind of has a notch, a little like bean-shaped notch on the side of it, and that is so that your heart can fit snugly against your lung, and that's why it's called the cardiac notch. So your right lung has 3 lobes, but your left lung only has 2 lobes because of that cardiac notch. So let's talk about the process of respiration. The actual process of respiration is the process of breathing. You have external respiration and internal respiration. External respiration occurs where the lungs are diffusing oxygen into the blood and carbon dioxide then diffuses into the alveolar air. This basically causes us to then breathe outward. So we are exhaling CO2. Your diaphragm relaxes and moves up, and our ribs are able to go back in. So then our lungs are able to deflate, pushing air out. Internal respiration occurs when you are metabolizing tissues where oxygen is being diffused into the blood and carbon dioxide is being diffused out of the cells, and this is what causes us to breathe in. So during inhalation or internal respiration, our diaphragm is contracting. It has to pull downward, giving our ribs more room to move downward and our lungs room to inflate so that we can pull air in. Every time you take one inspiration and one expiration, that is what we consider one respiration. So going is one respiration. The normal adult breathes about 12 to 20 times per minute. So if we were to pause here and set a timer for 60 seconds, we can actually count what our normal respiration is. So I'm going to go ahead and set a timer for us. And I want everyone to actually follow along while we do this. So I'm going to set a timer for 60 seconds. And you're going to just count how many times you take one respiration. So one breath in, one breath out is one respiration. Count how many times you do it. Go. Okay, you can stop. So how many times did you breathe in 1 minute? That is your respiration. Later in this class, you will actually learn how to measure respirations on your patients. Just for anyone that was curious, mine was 16. So let's talk about hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is the actual nutrient that basically is attached to a red blood cell that helps us to carry oxygen. So basically, hemoglobin is a protein that is attached to a red blood cell that allows oxygen to grab onto the red blood cell and then be transported throughout the body. The hemoglobin protein makes up about 96% of the red blood cells' dry content. So it's very important in our red blood cells, and without it, we would not be able to transport oxygen throughout the body. So what do you think happens when you have low hemoglobin levels? Well, we know that if hemoglobin is the protein that attaches oxygen to our red blood cells, and I forgot to turn off the timer. Okay. If we know that hemoglobin is what attaches oxygen to a red blood cell and transports it throughout the body, then if we do not have hemoglobin or we have really low hemoglobin, then that means we don't have the protein necessary to attach oxygen to a red blood cell, which means we would not be able to transport enough oxygen throughout our body. So low hemoglobin levels would cause us to then pass out because we would not be getting enough oxygen in our system. Other functions of the respiratory system include the movement of gas through the larynx, pharynx, and mouth, which allows us as humans to speak or phonate, creating sound. Most of the respiratory system is also lined with mucous membranes that help contain mucosal-associated lymphoid tissue, which produces white blood cells. So your respiratory system plays a really important role in keeping you healthy as well. So what causes hiccups? Hiccups are actually the sudden movement of the diaphragm muscle. They are involuntary, meaning that you have no control over when they start or stop, and there are many causes for it. Hiccups can sometimes only last a few minutes, but there are also some cases where hiccups can last for a few hours, and there's really no recognized remedies to help make them stop aside from doctor-administered medication. And this medication would only be prescribed to you if you were to have hiccups for a long period of time and it was causing you difficulty breathing and things like that. Some of the things people have heard of before is like if you scare someone, you can like cause their respiration pattern to change and stop the hiccups. If you hold your breath, they say that you can stop your hiccups. So there's lots of different things people have tried, but there's really no known way of stopping hiccups. Now, as we talk about the neural factors related to the respiratory system, the main 2 points that I want to mention are the medulla oblongata, which you've probably heard of before, and your phrenic nerve. Your medulla oblongata is that part of the brain that actually controls autonomic functions such as breathing, digestion, heart, and blood vessel function, swallowing, and sneezing. All things that we don't think about, they just do them on their own. That is part of your autonomic system. And then your phrenic nerve is the nerve that actually runs from the cervical vertebrae all the way down to the diaphragm. So it's important for breathing as it passes motor function or motor information to the diaphragm and then receives sensory information back. So there's kind of a regulation of all of these neural factors that have to happen in order for breathing to take place. There are many different types of breathing. The first one that we're going to talk about is apnea, which means no breathing. So remember, A means without. So apnea is not breathing at all. Dyspnea is painful breathing. Eupnea is normal, quiet breathing, just your normal breathing. Hyperpnea, that's hard to say, is excessive breathing. So this might lead to hyperventilation if you're breathing excessively. Orthopnea is the difficulty to breathe when laying down flat. Tachypnea is fast breathing. And then hyperventilation is when you are breathing so quickly that you are actually exhaling more air than you're able to inhale, which will eventually lead to you passing out. Lung capacity and volume, there are many different measurements, and I'm only going to touch on these very briefly because on Thursday we're going to revisit some of these slides and talk about how to measure vital lung capacity. So you have tidal volume, inspiratory reserve volume, and expiratory reserve volume. We're going to talk about all of these on Thursday. I just wanted to go ahead and kind of show them to you so that you get used to seeing them. Then we also have our vital lung capacity, which is what we're going to be learning how to measure on Thursday, as well as your residual volume and your functional residual capacity. Now, why do we need to know what all of these different lung volumes are? Because measuring lung volume is how we determine various disorders of the respiratory system. They're very important measurements that we need in order to be able to determine whether someone has something going on with their respiratory system that might need to be treated. Total lung capacity is a combination of many of these different volumes added together. You put together your tidal volume, your IRV, your ERV, and your residual air volume, put them together, and you get your total lung capacity. And we measure total lung capacity with a tool called a spirometer. We have very easy to use spirometers that are very simple, like the one here in the photo, where it's literally just a tube that you breathe into and it pushes air up and measures your total lung capacity. It's very simple and basic. And we also have machines that you get hooked up to that will tell you digitally what your total lung capacity is. And you can use the data from those machines to determine lots of different factors. You can also exercise while you're hooked up to those machines in order to determine how exercise influences total lung capacity. As an exercise science major, I spent a lot of time in college learning about total lung capacity and performing these exercise tests on myself as well as my peers. And so we actually got to use one of the really big fancy spirometer machines to measure our lung capacity while we were biking, while we were running, all kinds of really cool information. And then here's a photo of what one of those really old spirometers used to look like. It's basically a pod that you sit in or a machine that you get hooked up to, and they close your nose so that you're only breathing out of your mouth, and they measure lots of different lung capacities. And so sometimes they'll ask you to just breathe normal. They'll ask you to take in as much air as you can and let out as much air as you can, and they're able to collect a lot of different data this way. But we will come back to all of that on Thursday when we get to our measuring lung capacity lab. Just a reminder that tomorrow on Wednesday, we have our live session, and that Mr. Freeman will be joining in on our live session and observing me. During this live session, we are going to be doing two different things. We're going to be doing the model lung demo with the balloons and the plastic bottle like we did last year, but I'm going to be asking you some questions about which structures represent what and talking through some different key points of those structures and basically the process of respiration. And then we're also going to be playing 3.01 key term bingo. So please make sure that yesterday you did your flashcards, that you made flashcards, and that today you complete your flashcards studying practice, because during this bingo game, I want you to be actively engaged and be able to follow along. And we actually might be switching it up where at some point, instead of me calling the definitions, I might ask one of you to be calling the definitions. So just be prepared for that. And please make sure that you join the live session. That is it for today, guys. If you have any questions at all, please feel free to ask me. You can text me on Remind or email me, and I will see you all tomorrow.